Imagine waking up on top of a beautiful and wealthy blonde, accidentally grabbing her melons. Whoa, the dream of many, right? I mean, this is what happened to our protagonist, except he wasn't dreaming. He ended up there because he was sent to learn at a school for butlers and maids, but thanks to his appearance, he got into trouble with many waifus, causing moments that I'm sure you'd want to experience. But because of this, he ended up being labeled as a real pig. Really? First day, and you're already starting off bad. Dude, in that school, we see that excellence and customer service are one of their priorities. However, some maids don't seem to get along very well, and one of them was Selnia Frameheart and Tomomi Saikyo, as the blonde was calmly ordering tea, when the other waifu sits next to her and begins to lecture her, saying that her personality was somewhat annoying because she didn't like to lose against anyone else and was very irritating, and that comment almost made her explode. However, she restrained herself and told her that perhaps it was because she was bored of the monotony of the days and hoped that her life would soon change a bit. Later, we see Tomomi meeting with the director, and she orders her to find the new transfer student Akihari Hino. She also tells her that during the interview he made them feel uncomfortable because of his appearance, so she should be careful with him, but at the same time she was sure she would turn him into a good student. On the other hand, we see that the one who receives the protagonist is the blonde. Although no one actually asked her to talk to him, she just did it because she found him suspicious and started treating him badly. But since the guy didn't want to waste time with her, he ignored her and went on his way. But then the waifu got mad and tried to beat him up, and that's when he accidentally touched her boobs. The protagonist tried to explain that it was an accident, but as expected, the waifu didn't even let him speak and started chasing him around the school. Since the guy was desperate not to get beaten up, he scared all the waifus he encountered on the way, and the blonde thought he had also acted like a pig with them because unintentionally he knocked out a waifu named Mimina by covering her mouth so she wouldn't discover him. He saw another waifu's panties, spilled tea on another waifu's boobs named Saori, who seemed hotter than the tea she was drinking, and another maid, Sanai, put her whole butt on his face. This happened unintentionally, which was the craziest thing of all. But well, the chase ended when the protagonist stumbled upon Tomomi. She introduced him to all the waifus who were going to beat him up and told them he was new and didn't know how things were at the school, so she apologized for him. After all, she knew him for a long time and knew he wasn't a bad person, but as she said that, we see that the protagonist has a memory of her when they were kids, and she didn't look very happy. Later, the guy introduces himself to his roommate, Kaoru Daichi, and he doesn't seem to be very friendly with him either, because with the first impression he gave when he arrived, he surely scared him off, unlike the blonde and Tomomi who were thinking about him before gonna sleep. Although they didn't seem very friendly, I must say. HEY, if you want to know the name of this anime, it will appear during the video down here, so leave in the comments the exact minute it appears to send you a heart. The next day, we see the blonde taking a bath while thinking about how the protagonist groped her, and that's why she wanted to get revenge on him. Plus, the waifu who couldn't stand him helped her, and that's why she was more upset than usual. On the other hand, Kaoru helps the protagonist to tie his tie and they go to attend classes. There, the teacher introduces him to the whole class, and we realize that the classes were mixed, and it was the best because there were only 5 men in the whole school, the rest were all waifus. After the teacher finished her class, we meet Shingo and Sonk, or Mika. They introduced themselves to the protagonist intending to break the ice, as the guys were amazed by the entrance the guy made the day before. Besides, we find out that to enter that academy, the requirements were very difficult to meet, which makes me wonder, how did the protagonist get in? Because he didn't even know how to tie his tie. But oh well. Later, the practical classes begin, and since the guy was new, nobody wanted him to attend them, and on top of that, because he was a commoner, so the blonde started to mock him when she saw him alone, but at the same time she sat next to Fo so that he could attend her. But since the protagonist had no experience, he began to reproach everything he did, until the guy got fed up and started to deliberately pour water on her, and just at that moment, the clumsy Sanai tripped and spilled hot tea on the protagonist. Because of this, the guy had to go take a shower, and when he came out, he met the waifu who came to apologize to him, and to make it up to him, she proposed to wash his back, but the protagonist told her no, because with the fame he had on the first day, it wasn't a very good idea. However, the waifu slipped again, and they ended up in a somewhat uncomfortable position, but Sanai didn't care and started to wash his chest herself, which made the protagonist get more excited than he should. But just at that moment, his roommate and the director enter to bring him a towel, and when they see them like that, they think they were being pigs, so he ends up looking bad again without even being at fault. The next day, the guys have classes in the pool, where the teacher with glasses explains to them that they must be prepared for any situation if their master falls into the sea or a pool, so she sends them in with clothes. On the other hand, we see Tomomi talking to the blonde, as she heard her complaining again about the protagonist, so to try to fix things between them, she apologizes on his behalf, and instead of calming down and moving away, the waifu did the opposite. She went to the pool to keep looking for trouble, so she ended up embarrassed again, and as usual, she blamed the protagonist. Seeing the problem, we meet Toichiro, a guy similar to Prince Charming who tried to separate them because he didn't like fights, and in the middle of all the talking he randomly jumps. Then the protagonist gets worried because he sees that time passes and the guy doesn't come out, so he tries to save him, but then the teacher with glasses puts the pool in hardcore mode, and thanks to that, the silly Sanai trips again with him and ends up drowning. Later, the guy wakes up in the infirmary and sees that Tomomi was taking care of him. There we find out that the waifu's mother married a millionaire, and that's why she ended up there. As for the protagonist, his father passed away, and he was adopted by a relative relative with some money, but since the guy didn't want to be a bother, he asked to be enrolled in the school. Because of this, the waifu tells him that she would help him in the following classes so that he can graduate. At the same time, she opens the door, and we see that the blonde was spying on them. When they catch her, she tries to disguise it, but she was actually worried about the protagonist. Apparently, the blonde fell in love. The next day, we see Mimina talking to the protagonist, and since the waifu seemed like a kid, the guy treats her as such and even tries to look at her notebook, which makes the little one angry because everyone treated her like a baby because of her size and she didn't like that, so she leaves quite pissed off. Later, Tomomi gives him a card, or rather a permission slip to take an exam and be able to continue at the school. She does this because she had promised to help him pass the course, although in reality the waifu had something up her sleeve because she was smiling like in a horror movie. Just then, the blonde shows up to offer him her card, and in exchange she wanted an apology, but she's left wanting because the protagonist already had the one given by the other waifu, so she leaves quite angry. The protagonist seems to have the gift of annoying waifus. And speaking of waifus, we see the little one sitting outside the school to start drawing, when out of nowhere the Prince Charming appears and asks her to draw him, but the waifu, being very shy, runs away. Back in the classroom with the protagonist, we see that all the guys had their permission slips except Shingo. Poor guy was begging the blonde to give him her card, but the waifu wasn't very convinced. And well, after this everyone gathers to take the exam, which was to obey the person who gave them the card all day, and then write an essay on the results. Then the waifu starts thinking of evil things for him to do, but it was all supposedly playful, so in the end she orders him to spend the whole day with the little one, and despite him explaining that was the point of his exam, the waifu didn't care and ran away. Meanwhile, the blonde and Tomomi supervise him. Well, we see that the guy, after chasing the waifu all over the school and helping her find a cat she wanted to draw, manages to spend time with her, but while she was drawing the cat it escaped again, and she blamed him, even though she had been sitting still with the cat on her lap for over an hour. So to apologize, he takes her to the dining hall and gives her something to drink. Just then, 3 classmates arrive and tell him that they are eagerly awaiting her next drawings, but that comment makes her sad, and when she tries to leave the dining hall she trips and sprains her ankle. So the protagonist takes her to the infirmary, bandages her ankle, and also puts a band-aid on her hand, and to cheer her up he carries her to look for the cat again. But on the way they meet the 3 waifus again, and they tell the protagonist to be careful with her because her drawings were worth gold. But as expected, the little one felt overwhelmed by that responsibility and only wanted to draw things she liked and not what others expected of her. And that's exactly what the protagonist tells them. Also, because of his bad reputation at the school, they get scared and leave her alone. At the same time, he tells her that if anyone bothers her again, she just has to call him for help, and just at that moment the cat appears again. So the waifu finishes drawing it and then falls asleep, so the guy takes her to her room. The next day, they announce the results of the exam and the protagonist manages to pass. At the same time, Tomomi shows him a magazine where the little one placed an indirect message for him. Apparently, he also managed to capture this waifu's heart. In a change of scene, we see a waifu in her underwear in the dressing rooms, when out of nowhere the protagonist enters and accidentally sees her. But that accident was going to haunt him for the rest of his life, because this waifu was Ice, a noble who seemed like a nun, and seeing her in her underwear went against his principles. His servant, Hedie, gave him 2 options: either he married her or she sent him to God, although she seemed to prefer the second option more. But since the nun fell in love at first sight, the servant had no choice but to support her. Later, the protagonist tells the girls what happened, and the blonde didn't believe it was possible for him to end up marrying someone like her. But the servant started following him around the school and setting traps for him to spend time with the nun. However, the one who ended up getting harmed in all the traps was Shingo, because nobody told him to be a pig and stick his nose where it wasn't called. After this, we see Tomomi attending classes, and when she looks out into the courtyard, she sees how they take the protagonist away in a very funny trap. They lock him in a tent and the little nun prepares him some tea, as if nothing were happening, but the guy insists on explaining that it was all a misunderstanding. But this waifu was kind of dumb or mute because she didn't say anything, so the protagonist runs away before the other one slices his throat. Later, we see Kaoru telling the girls that the protagonist was thinking of resigning from the academy because of the marriage issue, and the blonde tries to pretend she doesn't care, when in reality she was about to cry. But the tension passes when the dumb Sanai falls again and makes a mess. We're barely in chapter 4, and there have already been like 800 falls, and 799 are from this waifu, poor thing. But well, back to the protagonist, we see how he enters his room while his friend is changing. But since this guy was kind of weird, he leaves for a moment, and then the servant comes in like a damn ninja, breaks the window and kidnaps the protagonist. So the guy tells the waifus, and they try to help him, because since the marriage issue was already getting out of hand, it could affect the school's reputation, and neither of them wanted that. Besides, the waifus kind of read minds because they assumed he was kidnapped to do dirty stuff, and yes, they tied the guy up 50 Shades of Grey style on a bed in the infirmary. The nun took off all her clothes and tried to get naughty with him, but just then, the blonde and Tomomi arrived, and Tomomi tells them that according to her family's rules, if things happen accidentally, like what happened to him, they can't force him to get married, so the ninja ends up accepting and takes the nun away. Apparently these two agreed because the waifu made a call before doing all that. Later on, we see a scene where the blonde and Tomomi meet when they enter school, where the director publicly congratulates them for their excellent grades, and from there their rivalry begins, as each wanted to outdo the other. But returning to the present, we see the blonde losing to her again, coming in second, and to make her even more angry, Tomomi rubs it in her face politely, and the waifu leaves before causing a scene. Then the protagonist also sees his grades, and unsurprisingly, they're not very good. And while talking with his friends about how to improve his grades, we find out that Saori and Sanyo are sisters. But the conversation ends when the waifu starts undressing out of nowhere. There's something wrong with these waifus. One undresses as if it's nothing, and the other lies on the floor. After this, the protagonist attends to the blonde in practical classes, and she asks him if Tomomi had always had good grades, and the guy tells her yes, but she shouldn't be ashamed of losing to her, and that comment makes the blonde leave angry as usual. Later, they ask the girls to stay in their underwear to weigh them and take their measurements, and there we realize that the waifu envies the blonde's body, and then when the protagonist talks to her, he tries to convey the same message, only he says that even though she has a better body, she shouldn't worry about it because she's smarter, but the guy, in trying to make them feel better, only makes them hate each other more. In the end, women, nobody understands them. The craziest thing about all this is that the waifus used to get along before. Even the blonde was the one who taught Tomomi how to eat properly. But well, after this, the teacher gathers the students to tell them that there was a problem with the water, and they couldn't use the bathrooms for a week, so they had to bathe in some hot springs behind the school. This news drove Dirty Shingo crazy, and he tried to spy on the girls while they bathed, but the teacher caught him, and things didn't end well for him. After this, we see the protagonist attending to the two waifus at the same table, and just when everything was going well for him, the clumsy Sanai trips and spills food on the blonde. Because of this, the waifu goes to bathe, and there she meets Tomomi again. After the visual delight they gave us, the waifu finishes bathing and tries to leave, but the door was stuck and they ended up locked in. They try to ask for help, but no one hears them, and being alone, they have an emotional moment as the blonde, despite her differences with her, tells her that she wouldn't give up so easily and would be a good rival. And well, since the waifus had been locked up for a long time, it was the men's turn to take a bath, and when the protagonist tried to enter, the dirty Tomomi started screaming, all desperate for the protagonist to help them. And because of her, the guy breaks down the door and accidentally falls on the blonde's plot, while the very dirty one mocked both of them. In a change of scene, the blonde tells the protagonist that a party is approaching where they'll have to wear different clothes, and the guy takes the opportunity to tease her by saying that she could also take the chance to change her hairstyle, which amuses Tomomi, who happened to be passing by, but not so much the blonde. After this, the teacher gathers them all to explain the details of the party. Turns out the commoners will also be able to attend, but they'll have to dress as waifus and the girls as men. For what reason, I have no idea, but I'm not surprised by the craziness they do at that school. On the other hand, we discover that Kaoru is actually a girl. Wait, what? Yes, people, she entered the academy to fulfill her father's dream, but with the party issue, she was afraid of being discovered. Now everything makes sense. That's why she was so reserved with the protagonist and left the room every time she wanted to change. And well, after failing a cooking class because of Sanai, we see the protagonist showering with his roommate, and since the guy thought she was a guy, he talks normally and tries to see her. There, the waifu gets nervous, throws water on his face, and runs out. The next day, the guys have a judo class because besides knowing how to swim and cook, they also had to learn to defend their masters, and the protagonist has to fight against Kaoru, who defeats him in every fight, and even more so because she pins him down, showing who's the alpha male, which made the waifu lose control and leave him worse than a punching bag. Later, the waifu stays looking at one of the dresses they wanted to wear at the party, and at the same time we see a flashback of her past where she used to watch all the women pass by in front of her with beautiful dresses. Apparently she had certain complexes for being flat in the front, not to mention that she was pretending to be a boy. But well, as always, the cunning Tomomi realized what she really was, and also that she wanted to dress up, but without attracting too much attention. However, it was quite the opposite because Tomomi did her makeup, lent her some bras, dressed her up as a maid, and when she entered the party she caught everyone's attention, almost as if the DJ stopped the music when the waifu made her entrance. Besides, Tomomi didn't reveal her secret, and nobody noticed either. In the end, everyone had fun, took pictures, and had a great time. To end the day, the waifu takes a bath, and when she comes out, the protagonist discovers her, or well, that's what we think, because he didn't actually recognize that she was a waifu and went on to take a bath peacefully. The next day, we meet a new student named Pina. She's albino, and I honestly don't know what she's doing at that school, because she spends most of her time playing with a magic wand, like they do at anime conventions. Also, this wand fell the night she met the protagonist in the forest, and he took it to the principal to return it to her. That's when they formally introduced themselves, and she let the protagonist know that she's an otaku. But that's not all. Tomomi tells the guy that she's also a queen and that the school could get into trouble for mocking her. But she actually said that to troll him. This waifu is really bad. So, to apologize, the protagonist tells her that he can help her write an anime manga. He meets up with his friends to ask for their help because he had no idea about these things. And well, that's how they all gather, and the albino shows them the anime she wants to adapt into a manga, and they all end up liking it. But they still needed a waifu to start, so she ends up choosing Mimina, who happened to be passing by. But she tells her that she doesn't have time to help because she has to draw. After this, the blonde also tells them that she can't help because the manga had very sensual waifus, and she didn't want to damage her family's reputation. So the albino goes back to her room feeling really down. The next day, she tells tells the protagonist that in her country, it was very common to watch anime, and she had learned many things because of that. And since she loved it so much, that's why she came to study at that school, because her favorite anime was from that country. Because of this, the protagonist wants to help her fulfill her dream, and he begs the blonde to help them finish the manga, and since the waifu is in love with him, she ends up accepting. Later, Pina visits the dwarf and gives her a letter asking her to reconsider helping her, as she would be waiting for her, and she leaves the first 5 pages of the manuscript in case she changes her mind. The next day, we see that the first part of the manga was already ready, and all the waifus were striking kawaii poses. Thanks to this, the dwarf finally convinces herself and tells the protagonist that she also wants to be in the manga because she was actually a fan of anime. She just didn't like to admit it, and well, after this, she meets with Pina and gives her the pages she had asked for, but she didn't actually want her drawings. She wanted her to pose in a really cute outfit so the protagonist could take some photos of her because he found her very cute since he first saw her, and well, after taking the photos, he takes another one of the group to remember that day. In a scene change, we see the protagonist on top of the blonde in a very compromising position. But how did they get there? Let's go back a bit to put them in context. So, it turns out that at the academy they did another test like the one where he had to spend the whole day with the dwarf, but this time it was the blonde who gave him the letter, and since she had helped him with Pina, he had no choice but to accept. Well, what the guy had to do was accompany her on vacation to her summer house, so when they arrive there, he meets all the maids and her father, who had a pretty epic entrance in a helicopter because he had escaped from a meeting just to see her, and the old man hugged him warmly because he thought he was his son-in-law just like one of the maids, and this made the blonde very uncomfortable. She invited him to her house, supposedly to learn how to be a real butler. We all know she wanted to spend time alone with him, but oh well. So they enter the mansion, she shows him the photos of her family and tells him the story behind them. At the same time, we see that Tomomi and Kaoru are doing the same thing because the very dirty one blackmailed her saying she knew her secret so she would go with her on vacation, although she probably invited her to plot something against the protagonist, and she was using her roommate. Returning to the blonde, we see that after losing at chess against the guy, the maid enters and tells them that their room was ready and they had to sleep together because the other rooms were under maintenance. The thing is, while they were playing, the blonde gave the guy a little alcohol, and she didn't know that he got drunk very quickly, so he started acting strange and ended up throwing her to the ground to do naughty things, but he ended up falling asleep on her chest. The next day, the guy didn't remember anything after the chess game, and the blonde, feeling embarrassed, didn't say anything either. Then, Tomomi and Kaoru arrived to spend the day together, so they went to the beach, had fun, broke the watermelon, buried the protagonist, you know, the typical beach episode that can't be missing. But while they were there, the blonde got jealous seeing the protagonist talking to Tomomi while taking care of Kaoru because, yes, the daughter of her mother brought her to the beach wearing her school uniform, and she ended up fainting from the heat. And when the waifu went to swim, she lost the top part of her swimsuit, and when he went to look for her, she ended up drowning, but the guy acted like a hero and saved her. There, Tomomi tells him to give her CPR, but just as he was about to do it, the waifu wakes up and gives him a big slap, thinking he wanted to kiss her. Although in the end, it was all a silly misunderstanding because when they were alone, the blonde apologizes to him, and to thank him for saving her, she gives him a kiss. In a scene change, we see Tomomi taking a bath and thinking about the kiss between the blonde and the protagonist. It turns out she had seen them without them realizing, and as expected, she got jealous. The guy charms them all. After this, we see Selnia happy, but at the same time worried about what she had done. So, when she returned to classes, she thought about finding the protagonist and talking to him so he wouldn't tell anyone, especially Tomomi. But it was already too late because when she found him, she saw that he was talking to her, and she invited him on a date. The protagonist thought it was one of her evil plans, but he decided to accept anyway. So, they meet after school and have their date. The blonde, having heard everything, disguised herself and started following them like a detective, but then she ran into the sisters who were quite silly, and they almost discovered her because of it. Although in the cinema, Tomomi realized she was being followed because she started shouting about how jealous she was, and they ended up kicking her out of the movie. After the movie, the guy goes shopping for clothes with the waifu. There, the blonde meets Pina and the dwarf, who coincidentally were also shopping. After the waifu chose the dresses, she went to the dressing rooms to try them on and asked the protagonist if he wanted to accompany her. But since he knew she wanted to troll him, he said no. There, Tomomi began to think that enough was enough for jokes for that day. But at the same time, she wondered if he was really flirting with her in jest. I don't think so. Well, after this, the guy won her a stuffed animal at a game store, and as the sun set, they returned home while the poor guy carried all their bags, and the very dirty one told him that it was practicing to be a good butler. Then, the guy stopped fooling around and asked her why she had invited him out because surely she didn't want to lose a bet or something against someone, and that's why she did it, as he had known her for a long time and knew she always wanted to be number one. But well, the waifu didn't say anything, just that she wanted to test his feelings. And speaking of that, we see a memory where the guy says in front of the whole class that he wanted to have a girlfriend, and Tomomi asks him who he was in love with at that moment, and the guy tells her it's her. What? There, the waifu turned bright red and didn't say a single word. The next day, we see Daichi cleaning the tables in the dining hall while several girls speak highly of him because his serious demeanor made him attractive. So much so that a noble waifu sent him a love letter, and since everyone in the school was very gossip-prone, they found out and started talking about it. Well, in the letter, the waifu told him that she wanted to go out with him and gave him an address to meet her. But since she was a waifu, Daichi didn't know what to do, and the protagonist and the other guys tried to help him. Besides, the guy with glasses knew her and knew that the waifu who sent it was very shy and probably had a hard time inviting him. But that didn't matter to her because she told the protagonist that she planned to stand her up and act as if nothing happened so she would forget about him. But the protagonist told her that it wasn't right, so the three of them started giving him a lesson on how to treat a waifu. What they didn't know was that she was also one, but oh well. After the crazy explanation they gave him, Daichi gets upset and leaves, and the protagonist, feeling guilty for pressuring him, went to look for him to apologize and take the opportunity to give him some good advice. He told him that the best thing he could do was to tell the waifu his true feelings so she wouldn't get her hopes up. At that moment, Tomomi was passing by one of the hallways and the blonde by the other, and they heard the protagonist's advice. Later, Daichi meets the waifu and tells her that he appreciates her feelings, but he can't go out with her. However, he doesn't tell her the reason, so she assumes he's in love with someone else, and yes, this waifu had also fallen for the protagonist. But well, at least he was honest with her. On the other hand, we see that the blonde and Tomomi were still thinking about the protagonist's words, and they also believed it was time to be honest about their feelings. The next day, we see the two of them outside the academy, and just at that moment, the protagonist arrives. So, it turns out the guy went out to think about who he should invite to spend the weekend with him because Pina gave him 2 tickets to a very famous amusement park, and he just happened to run into the waifus. However, he didn't tell them anything at that moment because the two of them went to a room to talk privately. There, they started interrogating each other to find out what they felt for the protagonist. The blonde mentioned the date and Tomomi mentioned the kiss, but neither of them wanted to admit they liked the guy. And speaking of him, he interrupted the conversation again to ask if either of them wanted the other ticket, and as always, the dirty Tomomi was the first to grab it to annoy the blonde. Then, the principal announces that the sports festival will be soon, and upon hearing that, the waifu goes to her and suggests placing the blonde and her on different teams so the winner could keep the ticket, and Selnia accepts the deal. Due to this, a lot of rumors are created about the winner of the festival, and the protagonist didn't expect something like this to happen over a ticket, but oh yes, it was going to be a huge mess. The day of the festival arrives, and we see everyone excited. You were probably excited watching the competition too, because in all the races, there were bouncing OPIS, butts, eels sneaking where they shouldn't in the waifu's clothes, sausages in their mouths, and the teacher's tremendous plot. This festival got really weird, but I'm not complaining. Okay, maybe a little. Well, just before the last race, Tomomi approaches Selnia and tells her not to let her win, and then she goes away very calmly. There, the protagonist asks the blonde why they were trying so hard to go to an amusement park, but the waifu almost blurts it out and tells him it was all his fault, but the guy didn't understand anything, and well, after that, they prepared a race, and the one who ends up winning is Tomomi. However, the principal announces that there was still one last challenge. There, the protagonist tries to cheer up the blonde because he sees her desperate. She tells him that since she was very young, she was good at everything, but since she met Tomomi, she has always been beaten in everything, and for that reason, she didn't want to lose. Plus, there was something else at stake. On the other hand, the protagonist also talks to his rival, and she tells him that she always envied her because she was perfect and wealthy, unlike her who had to strive to be the best, and that's why she set a personal goal to beat her in everything. Quite silly, but oh well. Then the principal announces the rules of the last challenge, in which they had to form groups of 3 and make a kind of pyramid to take the ribbon from the enemy team. Since both of them managed to get their ribbons, they reached the final. There, we see the protagonist doing his best to stay on his feet and prevent the blonde from falling during the competition. But at one point, Sanai loses her balance, and the waifu puts her butt in the protagonist's face, and when she leans forward, she rests her melons on the guy's head, causing him to move forward, almost kissing Daichi. Then, as she was also in love with him, she gets very nervous and ends up falling. There, the blonde manages to take the ribbon from Tomomi, thus finishing first with her team. Later, we see the waifus taking a bath, and we see that the blonde tells her that she didn't expect her to accept defeat so easily. But she tells her that you have to know how to lose to keep moving forward. Wise words. After this, the protagonist meets the two of them outside the academy to give the ticket to the winner, and as he saw that Tomomi was also trying very hard to get it, he decided to give her his, yes, people, all that effort for nothing. When he says that, the waifus get mad at him for being a fool and not realizing that they actually wanted to spend the day with him, and they end up scolding him. Then, we see everyone returning to the academy, continuing to learn, and we see that both waifus continued with the same rivalry as at the beginning, but despite everything, they were friends, and neither of them ended up with the protagonist. Well, folks, that's the end of this anime. I was hoping for a better ending, but surely there will be another season. If you liked it and want more content like this, don't forget to leave in the comments the word butler and also with which waifu you want the protagonist to end up with.